Oh, hello there. I didn't see you. Well, thanks for joining today as we go through the Great Depression. I know, uplifting things, right? All right, so we left off yesterday here, and we're going to keep going. So, right before the crash happens, on October 29th of uh, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, not Black Friday. Very different vibe going on. But we've got an uneven prosperity across the United States. So most people in the US don't have any savings at all. Farmers have been producing a lot of crops, and there's a lot of competition from other countries around the world. And there's also a lot of discrimination in employment. So, like, if things go okay, like, keep chugging along, all right, fine. But we actually aren't going to be doing that, obviously. We got a lot of new farm technology, which means that I can produce and amp up my production a lot less time, and I can farm more land more quickly. That means that I can grow more crops. But we all know supply and demand. The more stuff you have, the less it's going to cost because you're flooding the market with things. Okay. So we've got the good old John Deere that gets actually invented in Indiana. We got all different kinds of tractors and that kind of thing. If we look at figure one over here, my little, oh, no, chart, then we've got where the money actually is. Okay, so if we go way back into 1923 to 1929, right before the crash, that white and grayish bar, the top 1%, so the people who have the very tippy top, they have a huge amount of the wealth. They up to 70% of the wealth of the entire nation. And people like the other 90% of us, you, me, and pretty much everybody, we've got about 17%. Okay. So not really looking really great. Okay. So then we have something called speculation. So speculation is when you're basically guessing at the price of something going up. So you buy something and you hope that later on the price is going to raise. So this is basically what the stock market all is. It's going to, if I think that this land is going to be worth something, I can buy it for $100 and hope that in a month or 2 months or a year, it'll sell at $1,000. That way I'm going to make $900 off of my speculation, right? I'm guessing. And corporations, companies continue to grow at high rates because basically, as long as everyone kept buying these shares, then the value of these companies kept growing and growing and growing. This causes stock prices to go up, and eventually, until something stops it, you've got what we call a bull market. Okay? If you want to know more, check out this video on speculation, and it'll explain things a little bit. Okay. So, breaking it down, what causes the Great Depression? So, we've got our overproduction. So, we're able to produce much more of the stuff that people want. But the thing is, I can only produce, if I produce so much of it, there's not enough people to buy enough. Well, then I'm left with my inventory. And this means that these companies aren't actually selling all of their product. That's going to cause them to have a whole bunch of extra or to cause them to slash their prices, right? Supply and demand. Then we've got the stock market. People keep buying, hoping to get rich, kind of like they do today. We're hoping that it's it's like legalized gambling, basically. There's something called buying on the margin, which meant that I basically if I wanted to, I could only buy something for 10 cents for actually something that really cost $1. So this makes it seem like, man, I don't have like $500, but I got $50, so I can buy on the margin. And it's kind of like a form of credit. And so what ends up happening is it allows people to invest in the stock market who wouldn't normally be able to But when it crashes, they are going to lose all their money and they actually go into debt because, yeah, you can buy on the margin, but when it crashes and burns, you're going to actually owe somebody all of that money. Okay. Then we have trade restrictions. President Hoover, he signs the highest tariff in American history during peacetime. It's called the Holly Smoot Tariff Bill. And this is where I'm going to do my best Ferris Bueller's Day Off impersonation. So anyone, something Smoot tariff, the Holly Smoot tariff bill, and then the United States sink deeper into the Great Depression. Right? Hopefully, I sound a bit more exciting. Shady business practices and government practices. The government's not really regulating things. Remember, it's a return to laissez-faire, so people can do what they want. And hey, as long as the economy is going great, why stop it, right? We keep interest rates low. That keeps people keep spending money, and money is cheap, right? And then banks aren't really, they're loaning money to anybody and they're not being very responsible about it. We get a little bit of a fast forward, I guess, to this practice right about the time I bought really about the time that I graduated college in the 07, 08, right around there. The the economy took a tank, and this is when we had the Great Recession. And basically, one of the things that really caused that in the 2000s was banks giving people mortgages for homes they couldn't afford. So, for example, when I have good credit, I paid my bills. So, when I went to go apply for a house with Mr. Tom, the bank said that we could buy a house, I'm not kidding you, for $500,000. I laughed and peed my pants at the same time because no way, even if I have good credit and I pay my bills, we make nowhere near enough money to be able to pay the mortgage or the rent on a house that's going to cost $500,000. So I know that my monthly paycheck isn't going to cover that. But if the bank says I can buy a house for $500,000, there are a lot of people at that time who went out and bought houses for $500,000. Obviously, I'm not putting down $500K in cash. Then it would just mean I bought the house. So you got your monthly payments. Well, the more your house costs, the higher your monthly payment is. People got blinded by the fact that the banks were saying you could afford this when in reality they couldn't. And so then what happens is we have what we call the bursting of the housing bubble. People realize that they can't afford these houses and they lose them back to the bank. And then the bank kind of overcorrects and then doesn't give out loans to basically anybody. And then that causes the housing market to crash because people can't buy any houses, even if they could afford a much less expensive house. If the bank isn't going to lend you money to but get the mortgage, then you're not going to be able to do it. And so the same kind of idea that happens in the 1920s. Banks are just giving money out, giving loans out because everything's going great in the economy. All right, corporate debt. Corporations saw an increase in purchases by customers, that whole consumerism. And so they kind of saw this as like, oh, people are buying stuff. Well, let's make more, right? Let's expand. Let's make our company bigger. The problem is we get to that first thing of overproduction and underconsumption. There's a certain point where I don't need 10 cars. I need a whole one. So after everyone has their car, do these auto manufacturers need to keep producing cars at the rate that they had been? Or do they need to amp it up? The answer is no. Then that's going to cause the companies to get too big and they're going to collapse under their own weight. And then we've got cash flow. All of these things obviously deal with money. So it basically is kind of an illusion. It's kind of like that's why I call it a bubble or a balloon because it can keep pumping up and it looks much bigger than it is, but you get to a tipping point where that bubble is going to pop and it can't hold its shape anymore. And then there's nothing left once that bubble bursts. This is what happens. So all of the things on this page lead to that cash flow problem. And then when there's no real money to be had, that's when no one can pay their bills. All right. So again, here's another way to look at this. All right. So more of a flow chart deal. So big businesses have got a cash flow problem because they have made a whole bunch of stuff and people are not buying it now. So what they do? Well, they cut wages to save money. That makes sense. People then don't make as much money and they don't have money to buy things to put back into the economy. This actually ends up kind of hurting the big economy in the long run. Corporations have more trouble selling products because now they have a bunch of product and people are now making less money. So they have even more surplus and they're losing even more money. So now instead of just cutting wages, they just start to fire people. Now people really can't afford anything and they have to be very careful with their money. Remember, there's no unemployment in this time, right? It's just you're on your own. And then they try and buy things off of credit where it's like, oh, sure, Bob, I'll let you buy milk this week. I know you're good for it. You'll pay me back later. At a certain point, that goodwill is going to stop because Bob isn't good for it. Bob has no money because Bob has no job. So now corporations are suffering more, but banks are suffering too because people cannot pay them back, right? So all of this leads to cash flow problems. So you're trying to fix one problem, but then you turn into creating another problem. If you've ever heard the phrase robbing Peter to pay Paul, that's this kind of idea, right? If I cut things in one spot, well, I'm going to give it to another spot, but that just creates a whole new problem. All right, so the stock market, I mentioned a bull market. Okay, so when the stock market it's going real great, prices are going up, everyone's making money. It's called a bull market. Okay, this creates a lot of confidence and people keep putting their money into the economy. It's going great. Then we said buy on margin, so they only have to pay a small percentage. Interestingly, if you are arrested for a crime, bail works the same way. So if you get charged like $1,000 bail, I'm sure all of you have got a grand just laying around and you don't want to be in jail. So what you can do is you actually pay about 10% of that. So you can pay $100 to get you out. And then you have to show up for your court date. Otherwise, you have to pay the whole $1,000. So that's kind of the same idea as what on margin means. We use it in lots of different ways. Okay. So the guy in the top picture, we've got the $100. This $100 will buy this car, must have cash, right? No credit. Lost all the money on the stock market. That's a nice car for $100. Even back in 29, that still is going to be a nice car. Then we've got the famous statue of the bull. This is out in front on Wall Street in New York City. So you guys can go and see it and pet it. And that's why its nose is all shiny because everyone likes to touch it. Okay, so now we're on Great Depression's here. Stocks go down, and people can't people start selling their stocks because they start to see the price drop, and so it creates a panic, and people keep trying to sell their stocks. So literally in a matter of hours, the stock market crashes and just basically bottoms out. Today we have procedures in place to stop this. So they will shut down the New York Stock Exchange when it drops so low, to kind of try and cut off this idea of it really crashing. The problem is that if it dropped so many points today, well, tomorrow it's probably just going to keep that trend, right? So, but we've tried to kind of mitigate some of these circumstances with some things that we've put in. All right, so problems, what's life really like? So this is Dorothea Lange picture. You guys know she's a photographer who gets sent out during the FDR's term. Actually, she gets sent out to go and take these pictures of life. This one's called Migrant Mother. It's one of her most famous pictures. Like any photographer, this is the best picture in that series. So if you can go and you can look at all of her negatives and you'll see the same image, slightly variant. It's kind of like when you take a picture on burst and you get the best one, right? But she's a professional photographer, very famous. All right, so this is her taking pictures. Can you imagine your cell phone's looking like that, right? This kind of gets the word out for people to see what life's like across the country. Very influential. Some other photographs that are taken, right? So jobless men walk from town to town looking for work. I think that it's rather interesting if we wanted to analyze this photograph that you guys would all notice that it says next time try the train and relax, right? So this idea of this juxtaposition between relaxing and having money to take the train versus walking and not having a job. We've got someone, a guy who's sleeping on a park bench because he clearly has um, nothing to do. He's lost his home. Um, we've got billboards like the one here that says jobless men keep going. We can't take care of our own. Chamber of Commerce. So that's the entity in every town that is kind of like a hub for all the businesses. And so they're saying in this town, hey man, good luck, but don't stop here because you're not going to find anything. And then this other guy here with this little sandwich board on him. It says, I know 3 trades, speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, have 3 children, no work for 3 months, but I only want 1 job, right? Pretty crazy that you can be that, uh, have that much skill and still can't find something. We've got these long lines for free coffee and donuts, right, for the unemployed. We've got, again, other people who are saying, kind of advertising themselves, wanted a decent job by a decent man, right? These are people who fought in World War One. If you can imagine going through all that and then coming home, living okay for a while, and now you are in the middle of the Great Depression. This picture always gets me every time. 4 children for sale, inquire within. She does end up selling her children, and if you want to investigate this story, you can, but the story does not end well. The kids all really have a terrible life and they get split up, and it's just really not great. But I can't imagine this is the point that you were at. Okay. Um, on top of this, so then that's 29, headed into the 30s. And then we have the Dust Bowl. So we have this overproduction of farmland and it rips out the topsoil. And then when you don't have these prairie grasses and things keeping the topsoil down, you turn it into farmland and poor farming practices. You get drought and heavy winds, and it really stirs up these huge dust storms. And it destroys people's farms and homesteads. Um, Crops obviously die, livestock dies, they get buried in the dirt or they suffocate to death. Farmers lose all of their land. Um, they don't really have a profit. A lot of them end up leaving for California. If you've ever read Grapes of Wrath or see the movie, that's what this one's all talking about. They get the nickname Okies because a lot of them come from Oklahoma. Right, so this is a photograph of a dust bowl, of a dust storm coming at you. I can't imagine seeing that. So you still have dust storms out west. I've got a friend who lives in Arizona, and they'll occasionally get these huge, big dust storms that come through. Another Black Sunday, April 14th of 1935. So the storm carried twice as much dirt as was dug out of the earth to create the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal took 7 years to make. And this storm is like less than a day. 300,000 tons of topsoil was blown away. So this is, these tractors and these cars are buried in this stuff. So this just devastates an already struggling economy. People obviously lose their jobs. They travel to try and find jobs. So immigrants face nativist problems. So you can imagine if you already didn't have, weren't looked not kindly upon, now you are an immigrant in a nation where the citizens of that country can't get their own jobs. So we have the Mexican Repatriation Act. So President Hoover sends Mexican American immigrants back to Mexico. And these people have been American citizens. And he says, too bad, leave. Right. So that's pretty sketch. Obviously, people are hungry and their families are suffering. They're suffering. So we have a lot of community-based outreach, soup kitchens, bread lines, charity organizations start. Okay. People lose their homes because they can't afford to pay for things. These shanty towns, which I'll show you here in just a second, are nicknamed Hoovervilles. So like these little towns that pop up where people have just scraped together their existence, and they kind of blame it on President Hoover. Hobos, people who are traveling, usually along the railroads, hop trains, and they're trying to find work. Okay. Hoover doesn't really, he makes it actually a little less terrible than it could have been. However, um, he did not want to open up a lot of federal assistance because he thought it would ruin the American work ethic, and people get lazy. So he tries to reassure Americans. He says that, hey, if we do a lot of this, like community is going to come together, we're going to bounce back. We came back from the panics or crashes of 1893 and 1897 fine. So he's looking back in history and be okay. And he says, any lack of confidence in the economic future is foolish. And he said, just keep doing what you're doing, right? So obviously, all going great. I really enjoy this meme, by the way. All right, so these Hoovervilles, as I mentioned, this is how people are living their lives. Just take this in for a second. All right, so some more kind of failures, how he fails to respond. He does kind of try, but the government really, remember at this point, is really hands off. Okay? We don't have these big federal policies in place. So laissez-faire capitalism, government doesn't interfere. And so far, that tactic has worked really well. He ran on rugged individualism. So like we can lift ourselves up by our bootstraps. We can fend for ourselves. We can figure it out. We're Americans. We have like a can-do spirit. Okay. And then the Federal Reserve, he reduces the supply of money in the United States. Now that's going to reduce inflation, but it's like if there's $10 for our class and we each start off with a little more than $1. Well, if I'm the federal government and I say, okay, I'm going to take 5 of those dollars out of circulation, now I've just made that money more valuable, but now literally half of us can't have any. And then if the Federal Reserve, when they do that, deflation was already occurring, and people had to lower their prices because of this overproduction. So then we have the Holly Smoot tariff bill, which raises the price of foreign goods coming into the country, and that causes more problems internationally and at home. All right. So Hoover, economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement, meaning the presidency. Economic wounds must be healed by the action on the cells of the economic body, the producers and consumers themselves. So basically, he's saying, hey, U.S. citizens, you're on your own. Companies, you got to do what's best for you. Consumers, you got to do what's best for you. Government's going to be real hands off. This, of course, causes just bigger problems. Again, he really had faith that Americans and the American spirit would kind of pull things out. And it's just, it just doesn't really work very well. So he's not endearing himself to anybody. All right. Again, I don't know. I just can't imagine going from living in the house or apartment that you live in now to this. Right. All right. So finally, Hoover's like, okay, I guess we got to do something. This is worse than we thought. So we've got something called, what's known as trickle down economics. This is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. So basically, the government's going to give loans to banks and businesses. And those big businesses then hopefully can use that money to hire more workers. And then those workers can use that money to buy more stuff and pull us out of a Great Depression. So it kind of the money starts at the top, and it just trickles down from the very top of the federal government to big businesses, then hopefully to workers, then hopefully to local stores and businesses, and hopefully all of the cups in this picture are going to get filled. That unfortunately does not happen, and a lot of times trickle-down economics, it helps people at the very top, but it doesn't really help the most people in any kind of country. So that's kind of where we're at there. And Hoover out and out just refuses, he vetoes some relief bills that get passed through by Congress. As I mentioned before, he's afraid that these, quote, handouts would destroy the work ethic of America. So this is where FDR is going to come into play. All right. So FDR runs for president. Hoover's handing over, these budget, war debts, collecting on those, farm problems, tariffs, bank problems, unemployment, all kinds of things. So Roosevelt says the philosophy and style, he's kind of like, all right, well, what was working, what we did before wasn't working, so we got to reinvent things. So he has this idea that it is the president and the federal government's job to help Americans. So he creates what's called a brain trust, a group of people who are really smart, and they're going to come up with new ideas. He institutes famous FDR fireside chats on the radio. You sit by the fire and you listen to him talk, and he basically is being really a calming force and explaining in simple ways what's going to happen and his ideas to try and get the public confidence. He institutes something called bank holidays so that all banks are closed and no one has to worry about the banks like closed for the day, not closed like shutting down. Because what happened a lot of times were these banks, you'd go to get your money out and the bank would say, well, I'm sorry, we're closed. And all your money that was in there is now just gone. Now, today, there's insurance. It's something called the FDIC that insures all banks from the federal government. So if my bank gets robbed or it closes, I can still get the money that I am storing there. During the Great Depression, that was not a thing. And this is why a lot of people, like my great grandmother who lived through the Great Depression, did not trust banks. And so they would not keep their money in a bank. Right. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, becomes a political activist, which is a new role for the First Lady. She is all about women's rights, peace, the poor. She becomes a force all on her own. And she really transforms the role of the First Lady into somebody who has a say and carries certain causes, and not just a behind the scenes kind of person, but really out in front. Frances Perkins, FDR hires a woman to run the Secretary of Labor. So women had to make ends meet and take care of kids and cook and do all of these things. So there are a lot of different stresses on women there. So there's him doing his fireside chat, right? So all of the nice big microphones for the radio shows, people sitting around listening to the radios. This is like, TV and streaming before it was a thing. It's the original podcast. Eleanor Roosevelt, do what you feel in your heart is right, for you'll be criticized anyway, which is very true. So, basically you do you. She's the first person who says this. All right. In order to get this stuff through, FDR says 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. Also called the alphabet administration, right? So lots of different acronyms that are going to get used here. Some of these things, we've got the WPA, the SEC, the TVA, the FDIC. So that's why it's called the alphabet administration, right? So the Works Progress Administration, basically the government's going to hire people to help build these public facilities. They're going to do highways and sidewalks and bridges and all kinds of things. You can actually, at Purdue, there's still sidewalks that have the WPA still stamped in the concrete, right? We've got the SEC, which still exists, and it's going to regulate the stock market to make sure no shady stuff's going to happen. The TVA gets hydroelectric power, so getting power still gets used today. And then the FDIC, which I've mentioned, insures banks. So there we've got the Works Progress Administration, their logo, the SEC, which still exists, the TVA, and the FDIC. So these are all things that still exist, and they're really important. Okay, so things like Mount Rushmore, these big art projects that are meant to not only put people to work, but also really uh, invest in that American spirit, make us feel good about our country again. Um, TVA, you guys can watch this. It's all about hydroelectric power in Tennessee. So Hoover relies on emergency loans, banks, businesses. Basically, everyone's going to kind of help themselves. Roosevelt is going to give more direct relief and creates to people who are unemployed by actually giving them jobs instead of relying on just community-based handouts and things. Both have their place, but Roosevelt ends up doing a bit more for regular people that help them. The government, however, goes into debt doing this, but it ends up really helping to pull us out. So I guess one downside of things is that the role of the federal government shifts. All right. Roosevelt does face criticism, right? People thought he was trying to run everything and be kind of like so popular that he becomes a dictator. He doesn't go far enough in some of these reforms. Like I said, it doesn't really totally pull us out of the Great Depression, but it helps. And he was upper class, and some people say like, "Oh, you're dealing with the little people, and how dare you?" And you're blurring the lines between the elite and the regular. Okay, so New Deal spending, going to crush everything. Um, and he's just spending, spending, spending. So again, the US government does go into debt. All right. So we've got lots of people who are going to be benefiting, but at the same time, eventually it's going to have to be paid for with taxpayer money. So it's, again, a little bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul. All right. And this is where we're going to stop for today.